What if I told you drug cartels, terrorist groups, and torture tactics were all being supported by the CIA using your tax dollars? The CIA's outright disregard for international laws and human rights has been weaponized for far too long. This corrupt agency must be disbanded. One example of the CIA's corruption is the funding and assistance it provided to the crack cocaine epidemic. Another example is the terrorist groups that the CIA has brought to prominence in order to push its own political and economic agenda. The last example lies beneath the countless cases of cruel torture used in detention centers by this corrupt organization. As a service member who protects the rights and values of the Constitution, I feel it's my duty to advocate against the continuation of this venal organization. The CIA's affiliation with cartels has fueled the drug epidemic that continues to plague our nation today. The association between the CIA and narcotics traffickers is highlighted in the book, The Big White Lie, by Michael Levine, a former DEA agent. Levine highlights that the CIA turned a blind eye and even assisted the Nicaraguan rebels in their drug trafficking scheme in order to raise funds for their campaign. Levine stated that the close connection between the CIA and the rebels led to the massive distribution and extortion of crack cocaine within the US. This great influx of narcotics into our nation fueled the crack epidemic, which later destabilized public health for decades. The CIA hasn't only weaponized drug addiction, but also funded terrorists to push their own agenda overseas. The CIA is no stranger to weaponizing its own political and economic agenda over national laws. The most apparent tactic to carry out their agenda is through the insertion of terrorist groups. A New York Times article highlights the failed US-backed Syrian rebellion that saw terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda being funded by the CIA. The failed coup cost the US over $1 billion and saw countless lives lost in the Middle East. Another example of the CIA's involvement in terrorism is through Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone is known as the American program that funded and weaponized the Mujahideen to fight Soviets. However, the CIA-backed Mujahideen would later garner a great deal of power, transforming into the cruel and brutal Taliban. Both examples show that the CIA funded terrorists in order to push their own agenda. These terrorist groups have seen countless men, women, and children murdered, all for the CIA's interest. In addition to the CIA's involvement in terrorism, another troubling aspect is the agency's controversial use of torture. The CIA's blatant disregard for human rights has prompted global scrutiny concerning the agency's ethical standards and practices. The torture tactics employed by the CIA have ranged from physical abuse to sexual assault. The Human Rights Watch organization conducted an interview with two men who were tortured and wrongfully accused of being members of Al-Qaeda. These men reported being chained up by their arms to the ceilings for long periods of time, as well as countless waterboardings and beatings. These men were finally released in 2015, but the mental harm they've endured has left them destitute and unable to function on their own. The CIA refuses to take accountability for the wrongful imprisonment or even recognize the cruelties these men have suffered. More example of the CIA's use of torture occurred in the infamous detention center, Guantanamo Bay. Abdul Zubadia highlights the horrific realities of Guantanamo Bay in his book, How America Tortures. In the book, Abdul speaks about his experiences being beaten, waterboarded, and crammed into a coffin-like box. Here we have photos of what Abdul went through in Guantanamo Bay. If any other country were committing such atrocities, the US military would be at their doorstep. But since the CIA is doing it, is it justified? The use of torture in Guantanamo Bay emphasizes the need to disband this corrupt agency immediately. The outright disregard for international laws and human rights by the CIA has shown why this agency must be disbanded. The first reason is the CIA's blatant assistance in the crack epidemic, which shows that they have no regard for the overall health of Americans. The second is the CIA's assertion of terrorist groups, which shows that their corruption has even plagued nations overseas. The last reason the CIA should be disbanded is its heinous use of torture and how it's left countless people mentally and physically scarred. The United States is known as a democratic blueprint by many, but how can we live up to such a title if one of our government agencies are committing these cruelties? The CIA must be disbanded.